Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Distinguished Lecture Series in the academic year 2021-22. This is the New York Academy of Sciences Anthropology section, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. The theme of our series this year is emergent care and community. In the wake of our turbulent and abiding experiences of pandemic, pain, and politics, the anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences focuses our 2021-22 program on the theory and critique of forms of care, mutual aid, and charity. With this theme, we raise questions about possibility and solidarity in the face of entrenched social inequities and racialized structural violence. With this theme, we honor four esteemed colleagues from our New York community whom we recently lost: David Graeber, Sally Engel-Mary, Leith Mullings, and just last month, Paul Farmer. We invite discussion of how communities develop and deepen forms of care for one another and our environment in times of crisis or under enduring conditions of suffering. How might care be reactive, adaptive, relative, and revelatory? How do emergent communities, both on the ground and in virtual spaces, stake claims to a future that expands or contracts in the space of solidarity? This conversation invites discussion of the politics of humanitarian efforts throughout the world in recognition of the reality that much community-based care emerges in the shadow of dysfunctional governance and corruptions of neoliberalism. The global pandemic has highlighted the irony that care workers are often underpaid or even unpaid, their exploitation a symbol of structural inequalities accrued across generations. Against the centrifugal forces of capitalist modernity, what possibilities exist for radical mutuality in the future? What constitutes care as related to the social, environmental, ontological, or material? Rather than asking anthropologists to assume some kind of prophetic role, this series offers an opportunity to take critical stock of what tools and perspectives our discipline provides in terms of methods, theory, community engagement, and public commentary, as we envision and imagine new possibilities for reshaping society. We are mindful of the crisis in Ukraine, recognizing that this is an urgent iteration of imperial criminality that so many communities have suffered at the hands of subjugating powers. We seek to understand and engage in forms of care and mutuality that oppose and redress the injustices of all imperialisms, past and present. I now turn the camera over to Dr. Dana Ayin Davis, who is co-editor of Feminist Anthropology along with Sharmina Mullah, and is the director of the Center for the Study of Women in Society. Dana?
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It is a pleasure to be here with you this evening, and it's an incredible honor and a joy for me to introduce to you this evening's speaker, Professor Vanessa Agard-Jones. Professor Jones is an assistant professor of anthropology at Columbia University, where she serves on the executive councils of both the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender and the Institute for Research in African American and African Diaspora Studies. Vanessa holds a PhD from the Joint Program in Anthropology and French Studies at New York University. She is the former managing editor of two journals, Small Acts, a Caribbean journal of criticism, and Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society. Currently, she serves on two editorial boards, Polar, the Political and Legal Anthropology Review, and Environment and Society. And she's a member of the Social Text Collective and Scholars for Social Justice. As an extension of her commitment to environmental justice and social justice more broadly, she is also on the board of Land to Learn, an organization in the Hudson Valley, which is working to build a movement of food justice and community wellness through school gardens. Professor Agard-Jones has a manuscript in preparation, Body Burdens, Toxic Endurance and Decolonial Desire in the French Atlantic, in which she reframes the concept of body burden to account for the accretion of toxicities in Martinique, a French territory in the Caribbean, focused on material exposures to a pesticide called Chlordécone, and on immaterial exposures to racism, sexism, and homophobia. Body Burdens asks how contemporary debates about sovereignty on the island are articulated through the prism of ideas about porosity and contamination. So you're going to have an amazing opportunity to hear Professor Agard-Jones, but the other amazing opportunity that you will have this evening is that after her talk, Professor Agard-Jones will be in conversation with the inimitable Professor Jafari Sinclair Allen. Professor Allen is currently the Director of Africana Studies and the inaugural founder and co-director of the University of Miami Center for Global Black Studies. He is the author of Venceremos, The Erotics of Black Self-Making in Cuba. He's editor of Black Queer Diaspora and the author of the recently released brilliant monograph, There's a Disco Ball Between Us, A Theory of Black Gay Life. Yay, congratulations. Please join me in welcoming Professor Vanessa Agard-Jones for her talk, Racial Capitalism and Chemical Kin.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis, for that incredibly generous introduction. And I just want to say how thrilled I am to be in this virtual room with so many people who I admire and care about, and so many people who I do not yet know, who I'm thrilled to be in conversation with. I come to you from occupied and unceded Munsee Lenape land, with thanks to Stephanie Rupp, Baird Campbell, and the rest of the team at NYAS for the hard work that made it possible for us to gather and think together today. I'd like to add one more name to the list of folks we've lost in the last year, whom I'd like to honor in some small way in this conversation, and that's my colleague and friend, Stephen Gregory, who's a professor of anthropology here at Columbia, whose loss I feel deeply each and every day. So just to add to the list of people we hold aloft as we think together this evening. So my talk tonight is called Racial Capitalism, Chemical Kin, and I'm just going to launch in. I'm not going to do any slides tonight. I'm just going to ask you to kind of focus on the stories that I'm trying to share with you this evening. So I'm going to begin with Hopewell, Virginia, USA, in June 1975. Dale Gilbert was the first to be taken seriously, initially by a cardiologist, and only then by his bosses. Months earlier, he had been hastily dismissed, as others were before him, on his visits to the company doctor. He and the other men, white, blue-collar employees in Virginia's booming synthetic chemical industry, worked shifts manufacturing an organochlorine insecticide called Kepone, or C10C1100, at Life Science Products Company, a factory on the James River. They complained about involuntary shaking, about nausea, about joint pain, and problems with their vision. In the face of their physical hardships, they were advised by company doctors to cut back on after-work drinking and to find new ways to deal with stress. Even though they handled the compound without gloves or masks and spent their days enveloped in clouds of the chemical powder, they were offered tranquilizers, or so-called nerve pills, to address their concerns, and were told, in effect, that their symptoms were all in their heads. But an independent medical professional, Yinan Chow, who Dale Gilbert's wife Jan insisted that he see, knew immediately that something was awry. Chow sent samples of Gilbert's blood and urine to the Centers for Disease Control, suspecting that the chemical that he and his coworkers were making was to blame. The results that Chow received a month later confirmed his suspicions. Gilbert was suffering from what came to be known as Kepone intoxication. So I'm going to move now kind of quite abruptly to another place and time. And we're in Trinité in Martinique, on the east coast of Martinique in France, in October 2009. No one at the Trois Rivières plantation had heard of Life Science Products Company, which is where Gilbert worked. But the workers there were all familiar with Chlordécone, the French name for the product that Life Sciences produced, Kepone. In the 1970s, Chlordécone replaced HCH, or hexachlorocyclohexane, on banana plantations all over the island, when the latter was deemed too toxic and too ineffective in the face of insecticide resistance for Parisian regulatory panels to continue to authorize its use. I'm calling this person Charles Joseph, a pseudonym for a person with whom I worked. Charles Joseph, then retired, had worked for Trois-Rivières since 1969 and remembered spreading chlordécone in particular at the base of banana plants to combat the charançon du bananier, or the banana borer beetle. And he says, and I quote him, "with no protection. We kind of washed our hands, or not at all, before having lunch," he reflected. "I was totally ignorant of the noxiousness of the product." The pesticide was used at Trois-Rivières and beyond as the principal method of insect control on banana plantations in Martinique and Guadeloupe for only 2 decades, from 1972 to 1993. But in those 20 years, the compound did lasting harm. While doctors on the island were not in the habit of diagnosing their patients with Kepone intoxication, they were instead concerned with a range of other seemingly chronic health problems that might be related to chemical exposure, among them prostate cancer, gynecomastia, and uterine fibroids. So this talk charts chlordécone's journeys as it moves through bodies of land and bodies of water, within and beyond the human and non-human bodies with which we and it are entangled. It explores how a synthetic chemical joins a worker like Dale Gilbert in Virginia in the United States of America to one like Charles Joseph in Trinité in Martinique in France. And more broadly, how it joins populations entangled with the compound via less direct routes of exposure. Chlordécone has had many lives in this world, but I focus on the site of its production, Virginia, USA, and on a single but exceptional site of its use in order to plumb the ways that lives and plights are intertwined by chemical connection, a kind of relationality that is increasingly common in our late industrial age. Pesticides were the mid-20th century's commodity par excellence for the facilitation of capital accumulation. Central not only to what has been called the global green revolution of the 1960s and 1970s, the development and deployment of industrial pesticides turned military technologies from the First and Second World Wars into commercial and domestic ones. And as such, the compound itself is not unique. It is often compared to DDT, and like DDT, it is marked both by its toxicity and by its endurance. Various studies have posited that it would take from 250 to 600 years for it to break down naturally in the environment. Thus, chlordécone is in our soils, our waters, and our bodies to stay. Given this effect, chlordécone has emerged as a fellow traveler alongside a host of other industrial substances that are changing the ways that many people understand what it means to live and to live well, and to die at the right time, in this age that is called by many the Anthropocene. So I offer the overlay here of 1970s Hopewell, Virginia, USA, the site of Kepone's production, with 2000's Trinité, Martinique, France, one of the primary sites of its distribution, in order to understand one dimension of the plantation's long afterlife and its relationship to what Michelle Murphy has called chemical infrastructures. Those infrastructures, Murphy explains, assemble the, and I quote her here, spatial and temporal distributions of industrially produced chemicals as they are produced and consumed, and as they become mobile in the atmosphere, settle into landscapes, travel in waterways, leach from commodities, are regulated or not by states, monitored by experts, engineered by industries, absorbed by bodies, metabolized physiologically, and as they bioaccumulate in food changes, break down over time, or in food chains, break down over time or persist. That's the end of that quote. And so for Kepone or chlordécone, its infrastructures unfold on a well-worn path along the routes laid down by the transatlantic slave trade and by the plantation-derived commodities that have long lain at the heart of racial capitalism. In the United States, industrial chemical plants often came online on the sites of former plantations, as was the case in Hopewell, Virginia. Globally, where chlordécone or Kepone came to be distributed, the plantation link was even more direct, with the insecticide coming to work on the bananas that replaced older investments in sugarcane. So racialized and gendered discourses about toxic exposure unfold across this trans-imperial Atlantic terrain. In Virginia, Anxieties about reproduction via concern about the impotence of exposed workers came to stand in for a measure of the extent and consequences of the damage that chlordécone chlordécone exposure had wrought. In Martinique, a different set of narratives about thwarted reproduction emerged, both about impotence related to prostate cancer and about the estrogenic effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals. Claims about the sexual and reproductive consequences of exposure are at the heart of concerns about chemical afterlives. And these in turn rely upon ideas about a so-called natural body, its optimum health, and its natural, so-called natural genders, sexes, and sexualities. Though Virginia and Martinique are linked by chlordécone's infrastructures, they are deeply differentiated by the severity and duration of their exposures, the interpretive frames mobilized to understand them, as well as by the possibilities for remediation and repair. These contexts and their reverberations surface the enduring entanglements of reproduction with structures of racial capitalism. Chlordécone itself moves many to ask, what does toxicity have to do with futurity or with reproductive futurity? And then a further question is, what might detox have to do with a radical politics of solidarity or a politics of care? And so I want to say briefly that from the outset, this may not sound like a talk that is clearly about the question of care that has been laid out for us as the theme of this year's reflection at the NYAS. But I want to talk more in Q&A, and you'll hear me thread throughout some of the things I'm thinking about what detox, what toxicity, what these kinds of realignments of kin relation might have to do with the question of care. So considering cases like Dale's in Virginia and Charles in Martinique, we might ask what it means to feel or to sense or to know or to document or to verify the movement of a chemical within and beyond a body. Here, I want us to take up Mel Chen's insistence that we think and feel with toxicity in order to experiment with ethnography at a molecular scale, considering bodily material entanglements with this chemical and how people come to understand and articulate its presence in their bodies. Further, I wonder about the ends to which that apprehension leads. What forms of affiliation emerge and are deployed as this chemical makes sway into persons, places, and things? So this talk explores toxic touch in two registers. On one hand, as chemical kinesthesia, the always partial, rarely verifiable ways that this pesticide is understood to move across porous boundaries in human and non-human body ecologies. And another to chart what I've called since around 2014, when I started trying to think through this problem, chemical kinship. The articulation of a narrative about contamination, accountability, and communities of chemical injury inspired by this pesticide circulation in the bodies of people, both powerful and marginalized, both proximate and far-flung. How do we think about the effect of exposure across all of these kinds of scales of relation? Jody Melamed argues that racial capitalism is a technology of anti-relationality. And in terms of the technology's origins and intents, many of the dimensions of Chlordécone's story resonate with this analysis. But what of racial capitalism's consequences? I think Chlordécone's entanglements reveal one vantage from which racial capitalism is also pro-relational, in that it produces new kinds of largely unexpected kin. Among them, I would argue, those of the chemical kind. Chlordécone and its sedimentation in physical and social worlds helps us think in multi-scalar terms about the coordinates for and consequences of our late industrial entanglements, ever embedded in their longer standing relationships to racial capitalism and to colonial violence. The story stitched here is one of patchy phenomena, defined as much by the inexorable movement of a chemical from factory to plantation, as it is by human and non-human exposure. These scales of toxic apprehension present an opportunity to join up two strains of materialist analysis. This is what I want most for us to do. One that might be considered the old materialism via the commodity chain, and the other new, with its emphasis on matter and its agencies, the body's interactions with its environments, affect, and the sensorium. But this kind of toxic apprehension also presents an ethical demand. The constitution of the toxic, its diagnosis and attribution, has consequences, both intended and not, for the past we conceive and for the futures we hope to inhabit, and the kind of care we might imagine in them. So Deborah Thomas, our anthropologist colleague, offers 3 vectors by which we might construct narratives that engage history in a way that is different from what is usually expected from ethnographic analysis. And these are her words. Those were her words. First, she offers that we might think across geopolitical scales to write the stories that make an engagement with any particular place meaningful. And for me, like, I think Caribbean ethnography has done this in multiple ways. I think Deborah Thomas's work, Michel Loftriot, for me, has been an incredible kind of light. Bodies in the essay I wrote, Bodies in the System, in tribute to him a number of years ago, was about thinking through this work that crosses geopolitical scale. And I'm trying to work from the molecular then up to the kind of macro political. Second, we might move away from culture and culturalisms and into an analysis of structural lineages and inheritances to make clear not only how we clarify connections, but also how we might assign accountability. And finally, we might consider our notions of citizenship and sovereignty to be made in the interrelationships between various state and non-state actors, including corporate ones. So my talk is going to follow in the trajectory that Thomas sets forward for us, working at 3 turns. You're going to hear 3 turns coming up to delineate how chemical kinesthesia and chemical kinship might help us think across both time and space in our ethnographic practice. So the essay's first turn is called How a Chemical Crosses Borders. And it's the story of Chlordécone's transnational travels, offering one chemical itinerary with which we might think about the political consequences of chemical circulation as it's overlaid with racial capitalist itineraries at a macro scale. So we're starting big. The second turn is how a chemical becomes known. And in that turn, we turn to narratives about Chlordécone's commodity chain to ask after the ways that people sense the movement of the chemical in and through their bodies as they articulate concerns about exposure and its effects. And then finally, in how a chemical makes kin, the third turn, this talk turns to emergent as well as speculative modes of articulating chemical kinship, highlighting the problems and the possibilities that these assertions engender for envisioning and enacting repair. Throughout, the movement of this chemical across borders at what Stacey Alaimo has called the transcorporeal scale of the body and at the transnational scale of the territory calls attention to the intimate ways in which differently located people's bodies remain connected to commodity chains, to uneven relations of colonial and post-colonial power, and thus to racial capitalist world systems. I'm inspired by M. Jackie Alexander's insistence that transnational feminist scholarship plumb how ideologies traffic across multiple sites. I track racialized and gendered discourses about Kepone exposure across a trans-imperial Atlantic terrain, offering this commodity story as one way to understand the enduring entanglements of toxicity and care, reproduction and generation making in the worlds wrought by racial capitalism. Okay, so that's the intro. We're gonna do the 3 turns. In 1 second, I'm gonna take a breath. And we're gonna start with how a chemical crosses borders. So between Dale Gilbert in 1975, Virginia, United States, and Charles Joseph in 2009, Martinique, Trinité Martinique, France, lies an ocean of connection and disconnection, both a literal one, the Atlantic, and the Caribbean Sea, and a temporal or experiential one. Gilbert, of the American white working class, resident of what was called the chemical capital of the South, as Hopewell was called at the time, lived a life seemingly far removed from Charles, a descendant of African enslaved laborers, still working the plantation grounds of the Caribbean to which his ancestors had been transported and held captive. Yet they were, and they remain, materially connected via this chemical, Chlordécone. So this section of the talk examines the unlikely trajectory that brought the compound from the USA to Martinique, but also links its production and distribution to other locations in the Atlantic world. Here I'm concerned with what Michelle Murphy has called this chemical infrastructure, and concerned to insist that we live in a world layered with multiple chemical infrastructures for many such substances. But this talk experiments with what it might reveal to focus on just one, Chlordécone. What does it mean that this particular chemical, developed in the United States and distributed throughout the global South, accumulates in particular people's bodies at a particular moment in time. What story might we tell at a macro scale in order to make sense of its micro effects? So chlordécone, this chemical, was first synthesized in 1951 in the United States. Patented for the commercial market the next year by Allied Signal Company, which later became the Allied Chemical Corporation. Widespread production of the compound began in 1958 under the names Kepone and GC1189. From 1958 until the 1970s, Allied's factories in Hopewell, Virginia pumped out 3.6 million pounds of the active material, out of which they made 55 different formulations, commercial formulations for market. Of these formulations, the most popular were its pesticides, created to combat roaches, leaf-eating insects, and the larvae of a variety of root-boring pests. Like other chemicals produced after World War II, in dynamic relationship with that era's modernization imperatives for the so-called Third World, chlordécone's story doesn't begin and end in the United States. According to the National Research Council, between 90 and 99.2% of the chlordécone produced domestically from 58 to 75 was exported to Latin America, to Africa, and to Eastern Europe. In the continental US, the compound was only registered for use in very low doses. This was not a chemical that the US was concerned with using domestically. It was licensed for very low doses in ant and cockroach traps. Thus, market saturation came quickly. But its recombinations abroad were of a much stronger concentration and were intended for widespread application in foreign agricultural industries. The inequalities of this chemical distribution were stark. US markets were not the intended destination for Allied's compound, and the profits that chlordécone secured for the company were critically dependent upon its export as a product and as a source of risk to markets abroad. This is an old, environmental kind of inequality story. This differential exposure to contamination in the service of maximized profits, this biosocial spacing of environmental harm, as Beth Povinelli has called it, revealed the uneven political field upon which chlordécone's commodity chain unfolded. In 1974, though, Allied shifted production of the chemical from its own corporate mantle to that of a spin-off company run by two former Allied executives, Life Sciences Products. And together, the two companies did a brisk business marketing the compound until 1975, when Dale Gilbert's medical queries triggered an evaluation of the production process at Life Science Products. Over the course of the next year, it was revealed that over 100 workers and their families had been exposed to the chemical at very high doses, and that due to improperly organized waste management systems, as well as outright negligence, as much as 45,000 kilos of the compound had made its way into the James River. While early, Professor Lampier, I see you. While early scientific studies focused on the acute effects of direct exposure for the workers, the deep contamination of the James River prompted further attention to chlordécone's chronic impacts. The year after the story broke, the US's Food and Drug Administration halted all domestic chlordécone production. And by 1979, an international agency for cancer research had declared chlordécone to be a possible carcinogen and a certain endocrine disruptor. Its presence in the James, as well as in its proximate soils and in the food products that were fished from the river, would later be linked to both male infertility and to prostate cancer. And this is actually the settlements from this, the contamination of the James kind of gives birth to the Virginia Environmental Initiative. So you have an entire foundation devoted to environmental activism and advocacy in the state of Virginia that was seed funded at settlements with Life Science Products and Allied Chemical for their contamination of the James. So they have, that is the kind of reparation that they have proposed and completed in Virginia. So this is all happening in the late 70s, but while chlordécone's production and distribution was coming to an end in the US, Life Science Products was imploding at the time, its life was just beginning beyond the US's borders. So chlordécone had long proved to be a particularly effective insecticide in tropical agriculture, killing organisms that had developed resistances to less potent compounds. It was a pesticide said to work on the root and not on the fruit, meaning that you could apply it to things like banana plants and that the residues from the pesticides would not show up in significant numbers in the fruit itself, which was important for places like Martinique that were exporting and continue to export the majority of their banana crop, for example, and was sprayed manually to the bases of banana plants by workers who, like Charles at Trois-Rivières, more often than not labored without any protective equipment or clothing. And while the dynamics of its import and export to places like Guatemala or Ecuador were fairly straightforward, its introduction to Martinique highlights the curious power dynamics there. Martinique's simultaneous enmeshing in networks of privilege due to its status as a French territory and its marginalization from broader schemes of protection due to its location in the Caribbean. So for those of you who are not super familiar with these places, while Martinique and Guadeloupe are located in the Caribbean Sea, flanked by independent small island states like St. Lucia and Dominica, they're also fully incorporated French territories and members of the European Union. And by a 1946 decree, long fought for by their political leadership, these islands became French départements, an historic process that, at least on paper, made them equal in status to places like the Dordogne or Vosges or Savoie. But nearly 85 years later, these residents of these territories continue to grapple with the structural precarity of being designated French citizens de l'outre-mer, or of the outer seas, told that they are just like the French de l'Hexagone, or of the mainland, but made to struggle to attain that parity in both symbolic and practical terms. So while chlordécone's usage was halted in the US and in most of Western Europe in 1976 after the spill in Hopewell, and after people like Dale Gilbert complained and were diagnosed with Kepone intoxication, it took until the 1990s for the French government to rescind licenses for its use in the Antilles. As in other instances when the islands have been treated as exceptions to a broader French rule, French citizens of the mainland were deliberately protected from this class of chemicals, but their counterparts in what's called the l'outre-mer were not. And of the two islands, Martinique and Guadeloupe, Martinique has been the site of the most widespread use, contamination, and controversy about chlordécone in the region. Today, the island sits in a toxic plume, with over 70% of arable land containing maximum residue limits above that which is considered safe, although those limits have been shifting over the last 10 to 15 years. And so now they sit under the limits of what's considered safe, but 10 years ago, those limits would have said that those limits are not usable. And the waterways, both internal to the landmass and its surround, increasingly being diagnosed as toxic. According to the World Cancer Research Fund, Martinique is listed as having the highest rate of prostate cancer in the world, a statistic that many see as being linked to chemical pollution. In the past 10 years, the chlordécone scandal has prompted a conversation on the island about the French state's neglect of Antilleans' health, about the continued dominance of local white elites, the people who are called colloquially the béquets in the island's agriculture industries, and somewhat unexpectedly about the relationship of environmental contaminants to gender and sexual expression, which is the focus of my first book, but not this talk. And so as a compound that has the power to disrupt endocrine systems, alter hormone loads, and damage reproductive capacities, this environmental toxin is now a key player in new narratives about the relationship between bodies and their environments in the Antilles. Yet the chemical's use on plantations activates older stories too, about race and power, about capital accumulation and premature death, that have long been part of both the narrative and historical fabric of life in this region. Bananas have dominated Martinique's agricultural sector since the collapse of the Caribbean region's sugar trade in the 1950s. And while bananas have been the product that have dominated the last half century, Martinique's béquets have been the people who have owned and profited from the island's plantation economies since their 17th century inception. The béquets occupy a unique place in the island's racial and political ecologies. As the descendants of the first French colonists, they are reputed not only for their wealth, but also for their insularity. Headquartered in and around the East Coast town of Le François, béquet families morphed over the course of the 20th century from family fiefdoms into familial sociétés, corporate entities that retain control of once profitable plantations and of the accumulated profits that continue to secure their place as the island's elite. Béquet industrialists have long had an uneasy relationship with the power centers in Paris, as they've lobbied to maintain their autonomy, and some would say their stranglehold over the economy on the other side of the Atlantic. And there's a longer story here for those of you who are interested in having this conversation about the reasons why Martinique doesn't demand independence, for example. And one of the arguments is that the Béquet power was so total that the fear was that if Martinique declared its independence from France, became a kind of post-colonial state, that Béquet power would be absolute and there would be no kind of way to regulate these families and their influence on the island. And so the bid to remain in the French fold was in part about trying to do an end run around Béquet power. And to find a way for African-descended African-descended islanders, African-descended residents to find some sort of power on the island. But back to kind of why Chlordécone becomes an issue in Martinique in particular. So 1979 and 1980 were horrible weather years on the island, with cyclones David and Allen hitting the island back to back. And while there were no deaths reported from either storm, the damage to the island's banana plantations was catastrophic. And as Béquet agriculturalists sought to rebuild, the chanson du bananier, that banana borer beetle, further ravaged their crops. And plantation owners insisted that the only possibility for recovery was a chemical solution. And so the members of a family company, the Société La Honte de la Garrigue, the Béquet company that was the principal importer of Chlordécone from the United States from 1972 to 1976, they came up with a plan. Though allied chemical and life science products had ceased production of the compound, representatives of the society traveled to the US to arrange for the purchase of all that had been stockpiled in their storage facilities. So they had been sitting on all of this chemical that they couldn't do anything with, they couldn't move. And these Martinican industrialists came to the US to buy it. They went even further and they purchased the patent for this chemical compound and subsequently funded the development of a new combination for use in the banana industry. Rebranded under the name Chlordécone, the Société contracted with a compounding factory in Brazil and recommenced exports, sending Chlordécone principally to the Francophone worlds. And in just 2 years, the Société La Honte de la Garrigue created a new southern circuit for the pesticides production and circulation. And through application of both economic and political pressure, in 1981, these planters secured authorization from the French government to use this pesticide Chlordécone, explicitly listing Chlordécone as its active ingredient in the Antilles. This is after the French government had said this is off the table, right? Like European nations had said this chemical is off the table. But they made their application and they were successful. So from 81 to 1993, the Société de la Garrigue took up where Allied Chemical left off, only ceasing their production and distribution when in 1990, the French government retracted their authorization for sale, giving the Société and their allied planters until 1992 to find new solutions to their pest problems. And it took until 1993 for France to issue a definitive injunction against Chlordécone's use. And then the news on Chlordécone went quiet, at least for a spell. And then in October 2002, so this is 10 years later, France's Bureau of Consumer Affairs seized 1.5 tons of sweet potatoes exported from Martinique and incinerated them upon arrival at the port of Dunkirk in northwestern France, because the cargo was determined to contain unacceptably high levels of this pesticide, of Chlordécone. And when the incinerations were reported in Le Monde, one of France's national newspapers, the story caused a furor on the island in Martinique. It was a reminder that while food products deemed unfit for human consumption would never make their way to metropolitan French markets, they were being sold freely on Martinican soil. You have to remember, right? Like these are the best sweet potatoes are sent out for export, right? There had been no such incinerations on the island, and root vegetables as well as other foodstuffs considered inedible by metropolitan authorities were allowed to circulate in l'outre-mer without penalty. So by 2007, when Martinican intellectuals Raphaël Confiant and Louis Boutrin published their scandalous expose, Chronique d'un empoisonnement annoncé, or Chronicle of a Poisoning Foretold, their accounting for the presence of chlordécone throughout the island's soils and sources of potable water found a primed audience. A #1 bestseller in local bookstores that year, while the Chronicle's tone was wildly polemical, its message inspired serious, measured reflection about levels of pesticide contamination on both islands. Yes, okay. In 2012, France's Ministry for the Environment announced the prohibition of lobster fishing off of Martinique's shores. Citing high levels of chlordécone contamination, the ministry shut down fishing operations, fearing that consumption of crustaceans would lead to grave health consequences. And today, 10 years later, there are now more than a dozen species of fish and crustaceans that are periodically prohibited from sale. And concerns about bioaccumulation and other foodstuffs has led to vitriolic debate about the maximal limits of residue of the compound, counted in parts per million, considered safe, that has begun to shift consumption patterns for those who can afford it. The value of eating local, or manger local, has long been championed by the island's independentist minority, a loosely organized group of activists and intellectuals who've held the political line against Martinique's continued integration with the French state. Chlordécone, though, has thrown a wrench into their visions for the future, with the restructuring of social life occasioned by a newfound incentive to turn toward imported, less toxic foods. Raphaël Confiant, a public intellectual who has played a significant role in making the chlordécone scandal a part of the island's everyday conversation, said to me that with the demise of any chance for food sovereignty, the chlordécone's contamination was, and I'm going to quote him, the first time a chemical killed a political idea. We can't be free, he said. For some of Martinique's most committed proponents of political sovereignty, chlordécone has forced them to ask, without sovereignty, no longer imaginable without an independent source of nourishment or of healthy nourishment, what becomes of visions for the island's decolonization? Even beyond the question of food sovereignty, Martinique's agonized relationship to hexagonal France has been thrown into stunning relief by this scandal. Since 2008, the French government has convened 4 commissions under the auspices of the development of a plan Chlordécone, and the Assemblée nationale issued a 2019 report of their Commission d'enquête sur l'impact économique, sanitaire et environnemental de l'utilisation du chlordécone et du paraquat comme insecticide agricole dans les territoires de Guadeloupe et de Martinique. And so they've created commissions and they've issued reports, but much of that work has landed with. I was speaking with someone this morning about their assessment of what the French government has done in the wake of this contamination, and their response was, there are lots of reports and commissions, and not much else. So for Beke families, whose société control not only the banana plantations, but also the supermarkets, the import and export routes, and the major sites of ship-based commerce on the island, the government inquiries, as well as the earlier incinerations and prohibitions, cast a glaring light on the various levels of the vertical integration of Beke economic power. So they own the plantations, they own the supermarkets, they own the import-export routes, right? These are people who have a particular kind of economic power on the island. Two, it's been a reminder that they, like others, consume locally, and they consume locally produced foods, and are exposed to some of the same hazards as those of their co-residents. Local environmental activists have not always agreed upon the best ways to understand the intersection of the techniques of power and lines of culpability that have made the island's contamination possible. In local conversation, there's a triangulation among 3 perspectives. On one hand, there are calls for corporate responsibility that are targeted at Allied Chemical, which through a series of bankruptcies, mergers, and acquisitions, has since become part of the Honeywell Corporation, for putting the product back on the market. So we want to target Honeywell. On another hand, there's been intense focus on the failure of Parisian regulatory regimes to recognize the chemical's danger, and a further critique of the politics of lag, delay, and dérogation, or of the chronopolitics that put Antillean bodies at such risk. And finally, there have been calls for Beke accountability, to which planter groups have responded with an appeal of their own to chemical kinship. They argue that they too are contaminated, that their bodies too bear the burden of exposure. And upon that basis, they insist upon their own innocence. But before addressing Beke claims to absolution, we need to contend with the politics of evidence. And the next section of this talk moves from the scale of this global chemical circuit, from the planks of a chemical infrastructure to that of the body, to ask what it means to feel or to sense or to know or to document or to verify the movement of a synthetic chemical within and beyond a body. So I'm going to stop the big commodity chain story that can be a little snooze-worthy for some, and move to how a chemical becomes known. How do we come to know toxic touch? How do people for whom exposure has not yet become an object of biomedical intervention talk about their exposures? What are the less easily verifiable sense of exposure? And how do diagnostic anxieties take shape? I am indebted to Adriana Petrina's work on radiation exposure and her insights about the ways that her interlocutors in Ukraine, and I quote her, became masters of the reality of what science did not know about them. She highlights for us the ways that ignorance and imposition becomes part of the plasticity of these biosocial experiences. And while in the US and in Martinique, cisgendered male workers have become emblematic of acute, direct, and diagnosable exposures to Chlordécone, women touched by these chemical scandals often take on public roles as articulators of the less precise sensing of exposure and testify to their attunement to chemical circulation between bodies and the worlds around them. I'm indebted to Nick Shapiro's work on the sensing of a chemical exposure or chemical attunement. This is as much an analytical and political problem as it is a methodological one. Historians, literary scholars, and historical anthropologists have long theorized the constitution and consequent production of absences in formal archives. When it comes to toxic entanglements, the evidence, such that it is itself patchy, or rather mismatched, as Gabrielle Hecht names it in Being Nuclear. The sources reflect the unevenness of what is deemed important and what is captured along a commodity chain. Given these dynamics, mine is a narrative crafted from small rather than big data, scraps of testimony, gesture recoded as evidence, and is an attempt to also reach the sublingual experiences that state and corporate archiving does not capture. In that spirit, I want to turn now to two very different invocations of how a chemical is felt in the body, each from different points on Chlordécone's chemical commodity chain. So one is fleshy, a reflection of long and deep ethnographic engagement, and the other is thin, fleeting, and a reflection of the archive's limits. Patchy evidence is a dimension of analytic challenge in the Anthropocene, but a commitment to methodological promiscuity and an ethic of uneven apprehension may be just what we need to understand radically incommensurate experiences in this age. So I'm going back to Martinique, but I'm going to January 2016 to Fort-de-France, the capital of the island. Claude had just finished celebrating her 35th birthday. Her co-workers at the youth services organization where she works in downtown Fort-de-France had made a big production, she said, joking that she was officially un pied dans la tombe, 1 foot in the grave. As she reflected upon the unexpectedly serious way that she had taken her co-workers' teasing, our conversation turned toward Claude's anxieties about aging, her visions for her future, and the competing desires that others, her co-workers, but too her mother and her older sister, had for her, particularly related to her own reproductive futurity. Claude expressed some disquiet about having children in general, although they had all begun to pressure her to consider the possibility, and that, she said, made her worry about all kinds of things, about her financial readiness, whether she could be a better parent than her own, whether her partner would want to wade into the waters of lesbian parenting, but more pressingly, she worried about her potential children's health. We dwelled for almost an hour upon the lively debates about Zika virus that were everywhere at the time, and on the advice that health professionals were giving to women of childbearing age about delaying pregnancy. We talked about this seemingly endless stream of panic-inducing contagions in the region. Just as the concern about chikungunya virus had started to subside, Claude said, posters about protecting ourselves from Zika arrived to replace the previous public health campaign. But Claude told me that the unease she felt was not about these relative newcomers to public consciousness, the Zika and chikungunya viruses, rather that her concern was about Chlordécone. I asked her, well, what makes Chlordécone different from Zika or chikungunya for you, excuse me. Setting her coffee down on the table and pressing her hands to her chest, her belly, Claude said this: I know it's inside me. In fact, I feel that it's inside me. And though I don't know how it works, I know what it does. You know me, Vanessa, you know my history. Those horrible periods, those troubles with the fibroids. Fibroids love estrogen. Chlordécone makes estrogen. It's the same thing, right? There are days when I swear, je te jure, when I swear I can feel it settling deeper into my body. Where does it live, Vanessa? In my bones, in my blood? I can't tell you where, but I know it's there. And I know how I can get Zika, how I can get chikungunya. Those damn mosquitoes. But Chlordécone? It came from somewhere, the water, the food, my own parents, maybe. And I know I'll pass it on to my children someday, but it's all a mystery. It's inside of you too now, Vanessa. It's inside all of us. Claude offered sentiments that I had heard numerous times in varied ways as I've asked people in Martinique about Chlordécone. Unlike viral exposures, Zika or chikungunya, HIV or hepatitis C, bodily states connected to testing regimes and diagnostic evaluation, Chlordécone's environmental vectors provoke a different kind of concern. The chemical inspires an impulse to correlate. Claude had struggled through most of her 20s with painful periods, later discovered to be the result of uterine fibroids. She, like others, was aware of fibroids' estrogen dependence, and her own sense of being too estrogenic was a state she traced to Chlordécone's ambient circulation in her environment. No doctor will verify this for her, but she's convinced, and other such correlations abound. Very few on the island have received formal testing for the presence of the compound in their bodies, yet many are aware of its ubiquity and expressed anxieties about their exposures. Nick Shapiro has written quite compellingly about this very phenomenon, calling it an attunement to the chemosphere. And I've been thinking about this kind of attunement as a kinesthetic awareness of a substance's presence in the body. So conventionally, kinesthesia refers to the body's position and motion, to a body's sense of itself in space and time. And kinesthesia is the sixth of a traditional 5 set of senses. It's only haphazardly included in conventional definitions of the sensorium. It's sometimes subordinated to the haptic as a mode of touching within, and usually gets grouped with proprioception or our ways of feeling our body's spatial relationship to others. It's a precursor to, and in some quarters understood to be a component of, theories of proprioception. Psychologists, neurobiologists, and others concerned with cognition and the body have thought of kinesthesia as a sense of movement, for some, sensed by nerve endings and muscle, for others, sensed by the brain. Cognitive scientist and psychophysicist Olivier Kepone argues that kinesthetic function is crucial to how distant objects appear to a subject, and the limits how objects considered to be exterior to the body are sensed in relation to the body. And so this sense can extend our reach even further across scales if we stretch the meaning of the kinesthetic from the sensation of movement at the scale of an individual body to the sensations that arise in response to knowing movement both within and beyond the body. So Claude, for example, articulated a knowing and not knowing about Chlordécone, an embodied sensation of the substance that eluded diagnosis, but that made of this object once exterior to her body a substance of the interior. Her awareness of Chlordécone is not unlike a person's awareness of their proximity to any other object deemed dangerous, whether that object exists beyond or within the ever porous boundary that is the skin. And so my question is, might it be possible to extend our reach further across scales with this sense, to play with stretching the meaning of the kinesthetic from the sensation of movement at the scale of an individual body to the sensations that arise in response to knowing movement both within and beyond our corporeal boundaries? For me, chemical kinesthesia offers us a conceptual anchor and experience that is less defined or less determined by rules of evidence than projects like citizen science or popular epidemiology. As I've conducted further research along the chemicals commodity chain, I've been struck by other stories of exposure sensing, particularly those that sit to the side of those experiences that tend to be at the center of contamination scandals. Allowing our apertures to widen enough to apprehend the kinesthetic, as well as the interoceptive. And so there's another language for this is the interoception. So the ways that we feel things within our bodies. So how many of you can feel internal to yourselves, your heartbeat? Can you close your eyes and get quiet and feel the rhythm of your heart as it's beating? And that's called interoception. That would be one example of interoception. But how can we think of the sensation at the scale of an individual body within and beyond our corporeal boundaries? So allowing apertures to widen enough to apprehend the kinesthetic as well as the interoceptive widens our definition of contamination. Can we feel that within? Are there people who can sense things within? I think we can delineate differently who constitutes the population of those affected by toxicities if we can take seriously that kind of evidence derived from people who can do that kind of bodily sensing. A kinesthetic or interoceptive sense of exposure provides for the inclusion of those excluded by more scientific measures and an elaboration of indeterminate states at a more grainy scale than the binary demands of exposure verifiability might require. Okay, so I'm going back to Hopewell, Virginia, and I'm getting closer to the end. I'm aware of our time here. So I'm going back to Hopewell in December 1975. Back in Virginia, at the site of Chlordécone's production, I came upon the voice of a Hopewell factory worker's wife, recorded in December 1975 in public radio station WRVA Richmond's 28-minute audio documentary, Kepone, A Portrait in Abuse. In it, reporters detailed the history of the manufacture of Kepone or Chlordécone, the illness of company employees, and the pollution of the James River, which was closed for a time to commercial fishing, just like in Martinique, by then Governor Miles E. Godwin. And while the focus is ostensibly trained on the male workers who touched Kepone directly, their families, who washed their clothes in the same water as coveralls laden with Kepone dust, and whose male family members' boot soles covered in Kepone track the chemical from factory to home, make up a less easily apprehended demographic of people whose bodies ended up being burdened by the chemical. The voice of an unidentified woman opens and closes a montage of testimonies in the documentary's first 5 minutes. She says, "I had been having symptoms similar to those of the men who had Kepone intoxication, some of which were numbness, loss of ability to taste clearly, some level of memory loss. Actually, it was pretty irritating. It's been found that I do have a slightly enlarged spleen, and I do have an enlarged liver, which is also common among those who have Kepone intoxication." What I was interested in her testimony are both the diagnostic markers that this unnamed woman invokes, an enlarged spleen, liver, but also her self-diagnosis by comparison, the ways that she draws her own experience in line with others who've been formally diagnosed with Kepone intoxication. The families of life science products workers were not often tested for Kepone exposure, as their cases fell outside of the company's standards for liability, as well as the state's interest in occupational health. But like Claude and Martinique, this woman had a distinct sense of exposure, and it begs our attention to what possibilities may lie in the constitution of commonality through chemical injury or chemical exposure. In Hopewell, as in Martinique, ever-widening circles of stakeholders were drawn into the contamination scandal. Beyond the workers who interacted directly with the compound, they included workers' families, fishermen, farmers, and a broad swath of consumers. Most analyses of these reverberations limit themselves to a local or translocal context bounded by nation or by imperial zone. But as Chlordécone moves within and beyond the bodies of people like Claude and the Hopewell factory worker's wife, the United States and Martinique, for example, are brought into relation via unexpected lines of sight. Their experiences of exposure help us see how people in places not always considered in the same frame might be joined in networks of both local and global power. And two, how racial capitalism's transatlantic itineraries resurface across temporal scale. Their stories highlight the ways that chemical embodiments make certain relations, both problematic and imbued with possibility, more clear. If we connect up these sites of toxic terroir, what modes of political affiliation and disaffiliation might be made manifest? And so my final little bit is called How a Chemical Makes Kin. And I'm gonna move through it as quickly as possible because I would love to have a conversation with all of you. And I'm realizing how slowly I speak relative to my own talk. So There's much to be said about the long traditions of scholarship on kinship, both in queer and feminist studies across the disciplines, as well as in anthropology, our own discipline. Much of the more progressive edge of this literature calls for richer, more radically distributed invocations of kinship across boundaries of human and non-human difference. We hear repeated calls to queer kinship, to extend it across culturally constructed boundaries and across species lines, and to dwell in what Jane Bennett has called our mutual materialities. At first blush, invocations of chemical kin might represent some of the most promising expressions of these desires. By tracing our common exposures, we might reconfigure the bases of our concern for each other, our care for each other, and for the very beings with whom we might share the planet, But there's also a cautionary tale here, one of flattening, obscuring, and obfuscating claims to kinship that get deployed in colonial contexts like the one in Martinique. What of the claims to chemical kinship invoked by the Béquets? In their case, toxic exposures produce lazy equivalencies. As Cassie Fennell reminds us in her work on lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan, contrary to popular discourses of solidarity, we are not all Flint. Our water is not all the same. In Martinique, too, a collapse into discourses about common contamination obscures the very unequal stakes that people on the island have in defining and demanding action in the face of chlordécone's ubiquity. In the Martinique case, these spurious equivalencies are overdetermined by older modes of kinship claiming, themselves rooted in histories of racial capitalism. So in this section of the talk, I want to attend to the unexpected ways that some actors in Martinique have used this contamination to both articulate and repudiate claims of alliance by exposure. And I also want to explore how political potential might adhere to modes of relatedness claimed by radically incommensurate communities of the contaminated. In 2009, France's Spécial Investigation television show aired a controversial documentary on national network Canal Plus called Les Derniers Maîtres de la Martinique, or The Last Masters of Martinique. It was billed as an expose of the Béquet community and of their continued dominance of the island's economy. An instant viral success, Les Derniers Maîtres was credited with serving as one of the catalysts for massive strikes protesting la vie chère, or the expensive life, and that shut down Guadeloupe. Jadimar Bonilla's brilliant book on this question is directly in this line. But it had a more modest impact in Martinique, where the critique of the usage of chlordécone at the end of the film gained traction and more of a slow burn. And making a rare intervention into a notoriously secretive network, the filmmakers did extensive interviews with Béquet businessmen like Alain de Pointe, the principal of a company with shipping, agricultural, and other major commercial interests on the island. In the first shot, in which Hugues de Pointe appears, he's seated before an iconic fabled image, which is the Béquet kinship chart. You can do a quick Google if you're really interested in this question. It documents the lines of affiliation that link contemporary families on the island to their 17th century forebear, Jean Assier. And this is a chart meant to represent lines of purity in social relatedness, though such ideas are commonly dismissed in Martinique as elsewhere in post-slavery societies, but it appropriates the form of an anthropological kinship chart and turns it into a conical array. And it's one way of representing relatedness on the island. And Hugues de Pointe emerges as a villain in this film as he sits in front of this kinship chart. He valorizes enslavement as a kind of New World jobs program, and argues against human racial crossbreeding in one of his interviews with these reporters. And these are statements that ended up landing him in court in 2010 after the film airs, where he was charged with violating France's laws against hate speech. He had to pay a fine of 20,000 euros to the League Against Racism and Anti-Semitism. But his figuration as villain before the kinship chart works to identify this representation of relatedness as an outdated artifact from another time. Right? He's like, this is my family. We are encapsulated here in this Béquet network from Jean Assier to the present. But in contemporary Martinican worlds, both Béquet and not, the cultural politics of métissage or créolisation, or mixing, traditionally referred to as race mixing, insist upon the instability of forms of racial identification. There's a kind of outrage expressed when anyone suggests that there should be any ideological, practical, political, or biological invocation of difference between people of purportedly discrete races. So this whole Béquet kinship chart was a scandal, right? We can't have any kind of articulation of racial difference, equated with anachronistic anachronistic ideas proffered by greedy Becquet from longtemps, a long time ago, ideas about racial essentialism are assiduously avoided in the public sphere in France, both in academic scholarship and in everyday speech. Just a year before the release of Les Derniers Mètres, when asked about the Chlordécone scandal, a member of one of the island's most prominent Becquet families, instead of going full on where Becquets were encapsulated, we are of our own unit, instead said, nous sommes tous contaminés. We are all contaminated. In some ways, an uncontroversial statement. It became more so when he drew a relationship between this sentiment and the charter of a recently incorporated organization, Tous Créoles, whose motto is to faire de nos différences une œuvre collective, make of our differences a common project. So there's a way that even in a Becquet practice, the practice of preserving the kind of bloodline came up against a kind of public discourse about being a part of the island and being a part of all of the kind of biological matter of the island by virtue of contamination. So the politics of creolization in Martinique and in the Americas more broadly are nothing if not fraught. Dylan Rodriguez writes compellingly about what he calls the genocidal logics of post-racial and liberal multiculturalisms that achieve banality in our contemporary moment. He writes of the ways that social liquidation, cultural extermination, physiological evisceration, and racist terror become normalized features of everyday life in the US, granted. But what Becquet and Martinique, particularly the more liberal ones, articulate are an iteration of these genocidal logics à la française, I would argue. We might call them pesticidal logics. We're all the same. We are all one. We are all mixed together. That similarly have become commonplace on the island. Hugues de Pointe and others like him are deploying a new set of narratives about kinship in this moment that run counter to the biological logics of yore, but that still manage to retain the genocidal logics that were their aim. Organized around affiliation through contamination, they are meant to absolve Becquet planters of guilt for the profit-driven decisions that they made about Chlordécone circulation. They simultaneously function to position Becquet farms and Becquet families as equally entitled recipients of state care to remedy the consequences of exposure. Ideas about race, about blood, and their relation to kinship are transposed in this instance from créolisation and métissage's discourse of racial harmony and reconciliation, as Françoise Vergès has called it, to a new politic of blood and soil and harmony, heralded by common environmental threat. Tous contaminés, all contaminated, emerges here as a strange messmate with appeals to refigure or queer kinship, like those with which many of us are currently used to traveling. Drawing from older traditions of race and kinship thinking that evacuate the scene of intimacy of its violences, Becquet landholders' cynical deployments of kinship as alibi is something about which we must be vigilant. And so, as you can probably hear from what I'm saying, the problem with Becquet framings of chemical kin is that they flatten exposure in the same ways that panic prognostications about the Anthropocene, for example, and ways to live on in its aftermaths, flatten the anthropos, failing to account for the many differences in location, power, and historical trajectory across varied communities of human and non-human actors. The shared substance surfaced in these kinds of invocations of chemical kin might be understood as the sediment of toxic relationality, a demand for affiliation that is relentlessly horizontal, much like the tree slice image that structures the Becquet kinship chart. It refuses depth, and in the process misses the repercussions of radically unequal distributions of corporeal and environmental injuries on this planet. As we seek to understand accumulated harm, we must understand that while we might all be exposed to lead, to mercury, to PCBs, to stress, to stigmatization, to Chlordécone, the consequences of exposure vary radically across different bodies, different communities, and different worlds. But if we think the problems of evidence generation and political affiliation together, chemical kinesthesia in the same frame as chemical kinship, we might clear a space for a different kind of commons, for the kinds of conversations and commonalities that need forging for a radical politics to come, for a radical care to come. Rather than Becquet's insistence on territorially bounded, we are all contaminated and connection, we might think Dale Gilbert in Virginia and Charles Joseph in Trinité, people with disparate relationships to colonial and industrial power, but still despite it all, in this together. In her classic essay for Black queer studies, Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, The Radical Potential of Queer Politics, political scientist Kathy Cohen argues that the terms upon which we build our alliances need a radical revisioning. Beyond the families we choose, as Kath Weston put it, She challenges us to reimagine the alliances we choose, such that, and I quote her here, one's relationship to power and not some homogenized identity is privileged in determining one's political comrades. Where the non-normative and marginal position of punks, bulldaggers, and welfare queens, for example, is the basis for progressive transformative coalition work. Confiant en Boutrin's chronique d'un empoisonnement annoncé was made possible because of their recognition of kin. Reading US environmental disclosures on Kepone, and particularly the story of the Hopewell spill and its aftermath, led them to uncover the local story of Chlordécone in Martinique. So the stories of Chlordécone's transnational travels offer us one chemical itinerary with which we might think the consequences of chemical exposure at both a micro and a macro scale. Joining an old materialist story of commodity circulation to a new materialist concern with the sensorium, we might place Hopewell, Virginia alongside Trinité, Martinique to forge less obvious representations of chemical kin across scales and across communities, often siloed, distanced. Their relationship to racial capitalism is one dimension of their lives, one that is made manifest in chemical presence, might make a contingent but common vision for remediation, for repair possible. And chemical connections surface an ethic of toxic apprehension that would think commodities and kinship in the same frame as kinesthetics, that would theorize mutual entanglement, not just in the register of new materialisms, but also in the register of older ones, orienting us toward modes of affiliation and political relationality, toward more radically aligned invocations of chemical kin, appropriate to the desires, demands, and decolonizing visions of our time. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you. Applauso, applauso, applauso. It's one of the things that the health emergency has taken from us is the sense of being in a room and feeling the applause. And so we give you those applause. And at some point when we see each other in person, I think we'll all just have to keep applauding each other for what we have not been able to do over the past couple of years. But I'm going to be brief also because I'm really interested in the conversations that we can have together. And I just want to begin by thanking Vanessa and thanking NYAS Anthropology section for having me here today to sort of begin our questions and conversations, and to note, as we all have just witnessed, the keen analytic power and incisive, compelling narration of this complex narrative that might fall into a few easy or less true to life and true to the work places, and the work of finding more humane futures in the hands of another scholar. That is, that what Vanessa has laid out for us is a complex, there's a lot of table here, the breadth of thinking and scale here, literally from microscopic chemical compounds to soil and water, plants, animals, human bodies across oceans, and from the early 1970s to the present, even the notion of racial capitalism, chemical kin. Holding this in tension, there is a lot of intricate work that has to happen and that we have witnessed here in order to make this proposal, right? And so I want to thank you, Vanessa, for that and for inviting me to be in conversation with you. And I'm sure that this is for people who may know a bit of my work and know Vanessa's work a bit confusing as to what I have to do with this, because this is not my work. And what I've learned about STS, a lot of that I've learned from Vanessa. I also don't work in that area of what folks have come to call the Anthropocene, and I've learned a great deal about this. And I want to make a proposal here that it's also an instantiation of Vanessa's intellectual generosity, and also seeking to find perhaps unthought avenues. So she talked about unexpected kinships, right? So here is another, perhaps, I want to propose perhaps unthought avenues for intellectual work, not unthought by Vanessa, but unthought more broadly. So one of the things that I think Vanessa may have had in mind is that although I don't do STS or environmental anthropology, at the work of the Anthropocene, we are both students of and formed by what I have come to know and recently propose as Black gay habits of mind. And in short, this work on racial capitalism, chemical kin, clearly for me emerges out of the intellectual tradition of purposefully embodied narrative theory that is innovated by Black lesbians in the long 1980s, which I propose anticipates and to some degree mitigates some of the thorny epistemological, ethical, and aesthetic questions that anthropologists face and have critiqued since at least the early 1980s. And we can talk about that a bit. I'm sure I'm going to ask Vanessa about this. These perennial issues are especially relevant for queer anthropologies and queer anthropologists today. And so I want to begin by asking Vanessa, because I've been following this work perhaps since CSA in Barbados many years ago, with a very different instantiation of this. But the resonance of this work on sediments, endurance, living with and living through has been taken up by a number of scholars since then. Many of whom have cited the work, and I have to say, some who have just found it irresistible in other ways and may not have cited it. But that's perhaps another conversation, right? This formulation of chemical kinship. So in my reading, your theorization and refinement of since that time, right, of what narratives to employ, what the limits are of the various forms of evidence has been evolving from what the Sands remember through bodies in the system to body burdens, and then to tonight's talk, in which you take up the NYAS theme of care in your invocation of kinship. So I hear you calling us to think through the historicity and contemporary consequences of perhaps unexpected entanglements, not only between bodies, but also bodies and chemicals. And so if you would sort of give us the prequel, right? Start by our conversation by talking about the genesis of this project, its trajectory or rhizomatic transits, and where it is at this moment.
Gracious, I don't even know where to begin. First, I just want to say thank you to you, Jafari Sinclair Allen, for being here and in conversation with me about this work, and for the tremendous new, the older work that has been so important to even my thinking about the question of kind of genocidal logics and anti-Blackness and Caribbean kind of race thinking, but also the contemporary work that, you know, in Venceremos, and then the contemporary work, and there's just go ball between us in articulating a theory of Black gay life, Black gay habits of mind that I feel fully within in my own thinking, and finally kind of seen within and articulated as being within in your own beautiful rendering of the history of our thinking and the history of our life making. So chemical kinship and my thinking about that has been on the table for a very long time. I've been giving this talk called chemical kin / esthesia for a very long time, and I hadn't quite figured out what it was about, and that was because it was really the transition point between two projects, and I didn't figure that out until very recently. So my first project is about it's called Body Burdens. It's in 3 sections, in sand, soil, and sediment. And it's about kind of histories of and the contemporary politics of same-sex desire and gender transgression in Martinique. And it's about kind of the ways that questions about bodies and environments come to structure those anxieties about same-sex desire and gender transgression. And one of the major kind of questions in that first project is about Chlordécone, is about this pesticide. It's about endocrine disruption. It's about, what do these chemicals do to our bodies? It's an open question for people, not just in Martinique, but all over the world, quite frankly, at this time. And what does that have to do with how we think about our desire? What does that have to do with estrogen and testosterone, these deeply gendered hormones in our bodies that are impacted by these kinds of chemical exposures? But there was a deeper story there. And there's always been a deeper story beyond the question of gender and sexual politics and its relationship to the environment. There was, how did this chemical end up on this island? And what does that have to do with longer histories of commodity circulation, both in the Caribbean region and elsewhere? And I've been writing about that longer history and trying to kind of unearth that history, both through the Confiant and Boutrin expose, the Chronicle of a Poisoning Foretold. And then later, you have really fantastic scholars, particularly in the French-speaking world, people like Malcolm Ferdinand, others who are writing this story of how this chemical, this kind of classic environmental racism story of how this chemical comes to land on the island. But what I was more interested in than the story of the commodity as it circulated, and the question of reparation as it related to its movement, was how people were thinking about what I'm calling toxic touch or chemical kinship does for their lives and their worlds. And I was very fascinated by the fact that Confiant and Boutrin, who write this early expose about the chemical, only understood what it was because they were bilingual. They were English speaking and reading people who could read about what was happening in the 70s in the US and Virginia, and they saw themselves in the story of what happened there. And I was compelled by their invocation of a kind of kinship with the folks in Virginia, with these kind of factory workers that I would say I walked into the conversation saying, do you know anything about these factory workers? I didn't know anything about these factory workers and early on. And I wanted to understand kind of what kind of radical realignments might give rise to a different kind of, kind of class struggle, working class folks of the world unite kind of politics around this kind of chemical exposure. Because what Confiant and Boutrin were fighting against at the time was an invocation of kinship, an invocation of like, we're all in this together, that the Becquet families on the island were articulating and saying, oh no, we can't be held responsible for this contamination. We're also eating this food. So, we're all contaminated. It's cool. Like, there's nothing for us to do about this. And I really was inspired by the ways that people were going outside of the island to find other kinds of lines of relationality. And I think that's something that we need to continue to hold aloft as we think about, Chlordécone, which I try to say clearly in the beginning, but I don't know if I underline enough, is but one of millions at this point of chemicals of this sort, right, that are creating new lines of relationality, or creating new kinds of uncertain horizons based upon their endurance, not just in soils and waters, but in people's bodies. And maybe there's a way to think about our common exposures, though differentially impacted exposures, to create a new kind of politics. And I think being formed by someone like Kathy Cohen, who we have both learned from and under whose tutelage we have come to be the kinds of scholars who we are, that early invocation of a different kind of radical solidarity, temporally delimited, not clearly for, this is not a solidarity that we're going to hold on to indefinitely and completely, but it's a solidarity that might move the needle somewhere. Is something that I'm very committed to. So I've been writing about these things since 2008 is when I started the ethnography on Martinique, and 2010 is about the time I started writing about these kinds of questions. And chemical kinship was early on the table for me as a formulation and hopefully an intervention.
I think it's clearly clearly an intervention. I want to, and I think people should be sending their questions. We're gonna get to their questions, but I want to exercise my we'll do that. You can just focus. Exercise my my position as an interlocutor to ask another one, because you bring up the work on these genocidal logics, and I couldn't help hearing as you were reading about the problems with the Bequet framing. So you write, the problem with the Bequet framings of chemical kin is that they flatten exposure in the same ways that panic prognostications about the Anthropocene and ways to live on its aftermaths flatten the anthropos, failing to account for the many differences. And you began this project, of course, before the current pandemic, in which we are all in this together, right? And your invocation before of maybe a new politics can come of this. I would have bought February of 2020. I'm not sure, but what does come out really clearly is the genocidal logics, the politics of creolization, not only as fraught, but as I'm remembering, of course, invocations of Nuestro Americas, our Americas, celebrations of relationalities of métissage that are at best uneven and perhaps more reliably remembered as reverberating, enduring toxicity of its own, of racial capitalism. And I wonder whether you could say, because the literatures of Martinique and Guadeloupe stand sort of within, but sort of aside in Caribbean anthropological work, right? Those logics, and métissage is talked about in ways that we have not, and creolisation in ways that we have. I don't know that we've gotten to where we've gotten in Black Brazilian studies and Afro-Cuban studies in Martinique. So it seems to me that this is all a piece, which is one of the reasons why this is such an important contribution. This work is such an important contribution.
Thank you for that provocation. I have a couple of things to say, but I see Annette Joseph Gabriel was in the room. I don't know if she's still here. I feel like Annette is someone who I learned quite a lot from about these questions. But I think for me, kind of I was like scrolling through the Zoom is so weird. Okay. Thank you for that question. I think one of the things that I've been trying to do is to think about how racial capitalism differs across imperial zones, and to kind of to try to think on the page about the ways that the kind of Anglophone Caribbean stands in as the central focus and the central conceptual anchor for questions of racial capitalism, for example, but other things, right? Like, we know that there's a kind of dominance of the Anglophone Caribbean and Caribbean studies literature, as you know from your work on the Hispanophone Caribbean and Lusophone Caribbean. But the particular issue of métissage and créolisation, and the ways that Martinique in particular as an island becomes overdetermined by its chosen sons. So all we know about Martinique in the English-speaking world most of the time is we know Aimé Césaire. If we know anything, it's Aimé Césaire, it's François Fanon, and it's Édouard Glissant. And those three represent a kind of mode of thinking, colonialism, post-colonial subjectivity, race and subjectivity, that is unique to those three people and their acolytes. But it does not necessarily, and I think this is why anthropology matters, right? It doesn't translate in any fulsome way to help people in the places from which they come understand those questions. So all of that to say, I think your question about the kind of the kind of unreconstructed logics of mixing and métissage is very much at issue and at play in the context in which I work. Yeah, I'll stop there because I'd like to hear from others. So I don't want to kind of there's a lot more that I could say about this, but I will talk for hours. So I'd like others.
Well, we are here to listen to you talk for hours. There is a question about methods, and that this person said, I'm interested in the many layers of kinship: transatlantic kinship, imaginaries, chemical kinships, contested kinships, nationality, and they're curious about they're curious to see your field notes, right? To learn more about your methods, how you bring together anthropological tools of kinship, which are themselves anchored in imperial expectations of kin, and adapt them to analyze kinship at so many diverse registers. And they thank you for this incredible talk and conversation.
And thank you for that beautiful question. It's fantastic. I think I've had to, all the queer studies people will say we're like promiscuous with our methods and promiscuous with our theories. But I think there is something to kind of hold on to about that. The kind of the sense of the promiscuity of approach, but is also anchored in, like, I really do, I take field notes. I use a note-taking app and I'm very committed to it. And I care about it, and I care about my notes, and I care about the preservation of those notes, and I care about the analysis of those notes. So I think the question maybe is trying to get me to say something about the kinds of questions I ask or the places where I look for the answers to these questions. So, for example, when I'm interviewing someone, like it's so hard. I always forget the pseudonym because I can only call this person by their real name, but the person who worked on the Trois Rivières plantation, whose name I literally cannot hold in my head, in the pseudonym that we came up with together. Like, we made the pseudonym.
Happens to me all the time. Yeah.
I know. I'm like, I cannot say out loud what that pseudonym is, but I could say his name. When we were talking about the Trois Rivières plantation and Chlordécone, he's like, okay, so why do you care about this? And I said, well, here's what I know. Here's the book I've read. He knew the book. And, we talked about, what we knew about from the book. And I said, there's a whole story in Virginia, and I'm trying to understand that story too. And he was like, those are our brothers and sisters in arms. I was like, okay, like, let me take that. Like, okay. Like, he used the kind of kinship language to talk about what he understood to be the other node of this chemical, this kind of like this circulation, kind of unprompted. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think kinship works for what I do, is because almost every time that it's come up in my field notes, it's been unprompted. I'm not asking people about kinship. That's not my question. My questions are about, like, what do you think this chemical is? What do you think it does? How do you feel about it in your, like, is it in your body? Do you think it is? How does it work in your body? Like, what's endocrine disruption? Do you know about that? Like, what does it mean? How do you think about same-sex desire? What's the origin story for same-sex desire? What's the origin story for gender transgression? My questions have nothing to do with kinship in that way, but it comes up always in my conversation with people. So that is like the part of me that feels most like an anthropologist. I am clearly an anthropologist, but the part of me that feels most like an anthropologist is the part that really is trying to track how people think about the world from their own kind of completely kind of independently derived understandings of who they are and how they relate to the rest of the world. And that's a big part of my method, is just really sitting with and trying to be attentive to how people frame their own understanding, their own analyses of the world in which they live. And the other part is really, I mean, I think it's Michel Triot, it's Peasants in Capital. I mean, it's really like, I wrote one essay about this, but it feels like the deepest declaration of my methodological commitments. But Triot was like, we need to go from the village to the world, and like, we need to think across scale, and like, that is part of the work of anthropologists. And my challenge to Triot was like, we need to get more granular than the village to the
Right.
body, to the sub-body kind of scale. But I do think that like that is our work, and it's what we are uniquely positioned to be able to do through our ethnographic engagements, through our historical engagements. And so that is the other, I guess that's the other kind of methodological commitment I have, is to ask people questions, to try to ask questions at a variety of scales, and to try to observe at a variety of scales, right? To say, you know, with one of my primary interlocutors, I was like, look, we are gonna like, I'm cool, can I come with you everywhere, both to like your family gatherings on Sundays after church, and to when you go to the clinic and have your T cell count.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, and we're going from the micro to the to a kind of semi-macro in that sense. And I want to just be there to bear witness and to have conversations with you along the way. So that is a part of my methodological commitment. And chemical kinship arises completely outside of the set of questions that I care about. It really is kind of sui generis in that way. It's like, yeah.
I was, so one of the, okay, so I'm going to ask Alyssa James's question, because she
Alyssa.
is in Martinique and she doesn't have the bandwidth to ask this, but and she says hi.
You're
but
so
what,
great. Alyssa James, keep an eye out for her, everybody.
So there are two things before her question is along the same lines as my question, but I was also going to say that methodologically, one of the things that I've been thinking about and arguing in the Margot Weiss collection, the Queer Anthropology collection, is that some of these are also prefigured by Audre Lorde's notion of knowing one another and of I am only a relative, right? So that your position on the island, listening is one of an anthropologist, but is also one of someone who is a relative or relative to folks in a very particular way and politically aligned for a number of reasons, which goes to Alyssa's question and mine about how your interlocutor understands Chlordécone as something that's already inside of them. The state recently opened up the possibility for any resident to be tested for Chlordécone levels in their bodies. Yeah. And Alyssa wondered whether you have a sense of the reception of this testing and whether this possibility provokes new kinds of concerns or connections for Martinicans.
That's a fantastic question. And it's a question I don't have an answer to, I'll be honest. Like, I have heard from people about this opening. I have not been doing ethnographic research in the last year, in part because of the pandemic. Joy, are you still there? I hope you're still there. The last year and a half, last 2 years, whatever, how many years we've been in a pandemic, there you are. But it's a great question, right? Like, what happens when the state starts to change its relationship to these categories of exposure and affiliation? My sense is that, I mean, part of what I want to say about chemical kinesthesia and why that's important to me, that it stays in the frame, is that I don't want to rely so heavily, and this is part of my SDS, I have like very thin SDS training. I came out of the most amazing SDS place at NYU in anthropology, but I didn't know I was an SDS person while I was there. So I only kind of availed myself of that kind of training at the very end of my time. And I wish I'd spent my entire career at NYU, like sitting at Raina and Emily's feet and being like, teach me everything you know. But part of what I know, you know, from my experience in the world of science and technology studies is that we ask questions about the constitution of evidence and the constitution of diagnosis, and even like the availability of these diagnostic kind of categories for people now. Great. But I think the question I'm more interested in is the people who have the chemical kinesthesia, who are like, I don't need the state to tell me I'm exposed. I'm feeling this in my body in a certain kind of way, or I'm feeling the interoception of of this compound. And I'm trying to understand what that means for me. And I think that for me is more interesting than even formal diagnosis. It's people trying to feel their way into the world. And I think that kind of feeling, so in the queer anthropologies collection that you and I are talking about, that Margot Weiss is putting together, part of what I'm saying is there's a relationship between the kind of attunement to toxicity and gaydar. So my essay is all about like, we feel our way into the world, right? Like we feel our way into the situations that are safe. We feel our way into our kinships. We feel our way into all kinds of things. And I think that is actually more of what I'm interested in learning more about than actual diagnoses of chemical touch or toxic touch. Because I think the reality is that Martinique, everyone in Martinique has chlordécone in their bodies. Like the reality, like if you can really think in an unhinged, in a clear way, it's the reality is that everyone has it, right? Years ago, they were doing tests of people giving birth on the island. They were doing tests of breast milk and umbilical cord blood, and 90-something% of people were coming back with chlordécone in their breast milk and their umbilical cord blood. So we have generations of people who are just, kind of chlordéconed from the start, keponed from the start. So like whether or not we can diagnose it scientifically, I think in some ways doesn't matter. The question is, do we feel it? And if we feel it, what do those feelings inspire for us in terms of our ability to connect to others who feel it too? And that feels like gaydar. And that feels like different. It feels like the positive feeling of connecting via gaydar, but also I don't know what the negative feeling is of knowing that there are places that don't feel safe, or knowing that there are places that don't feel right in our bodies. And so part of what I'm trying to also understand here are the levels at which we can think this contamination in and beyond individual bodies and in and beyond scientific standards of measurement. And I think there's something about chemical kinship that allows us to do that and to say, okay, these people long ago who are not actually alive anymore, most of them in Hopewell, Virginia, are our kids.
Right. I just wanted, because of time, we want to get in a question by Dr. Joseph Gabriel, who's going to ask the question, and then we'll end with a question from Dr. Davis.
Great. I'm so nervous.
Oh my gosh, this is so amazing.
Where are you? Oh wait, I can't see you. Hold on. I have to find you. Okay, there you are.
Hi.
Okay, also, can we please say that the work on Suzanne Césaire that Dr. Joseph Gabriel is doing is unbelievable and mind-bending, and you all need to read it. Okay.
Oh my gosh, that means so much to me coming from you. Thank you. And I mean, I wish thank you were enough to just express my gratitude for this talk, for everything that I've learned from your work and continue to learn from your work. But I just wanted to ask a question really quickly about, I mean, you ended your comment just now with that terrifying statistic, right, of the percentage of, right, mothers and babies, and when we think about generations, etc. But I wanted to ask, I guess, along the thematic lines of care that we've been thinking along this evening, how do the Martinicans that you talk to think about repair? And I ask this because, right, I'm coming from a literary framework where I think about narrative, but when I approach the story of Chlordécone in Martinique, it's numbers, right? It's the percentages, the percentage of land and water that's polluted. It's the statistics on prostate cancer. It's the terrifying half-life of this chemical, right? It's just the numbers, and the numbers become so overwhelming that I have no idea, I don't know where to go, right? And so I'm wondering, in the face of a poisoning that seems so complete and total, if you think about the title of, Confiant and Boutrin's book, right, a poison foretold, it's already happened, it's total, it's complete, it's done. How does one think futurity? How does one think repair? And so, if you could just kind of talk us through that a little bit. And thank you again so much.
It's so glad to see you. Okay, yes, okay, I'll try. I'm gonna try. Look, I want to do that with you. I kind of want you to be in here with me. So there are some projects. There are some folks doing really cool stuff. So there are people who've been running kind of organic, land-based projects who are trying to think of ways to grow things on contaminated land that turns into biofuel, for example, right? Like to grow a ton of cane that nobody consumes except for cars, because there are a lot of cars in Martinique. There's like 2-point-something cars per person on the island. It is a wealthy place in that way. So there are ground up projects that are trying to address the question of remediation. Like forget about repair, but just remediation. Like how do we deal with the fact that our soil is unusable or is usable, but we'd rather not, right? Because the soil creates the conditions from which we are gonna be further contaminated or further impacted by or exposed to this chemical. So there's lots of people thinking about bioremediation and, it just novel ways to kind of grow crops that could be used in forms that are not about human or non-human consumption, right? Like one of the major problems on the island is bioaccumulation. So the fact that like the smaller organisms are consuming the chlordécone and then it's kind of compounding in the bodies of larger organisms, right? And so you see things like the shellfish are major accumulators of the bioaccumulation from below. And so we're not trying to kind of go that route. Like the remediation is about how do we like take this out of the living world into some other form. And so that other form is like the petrocapitalist state. But okay, sure. How do we like use these soils otherwise? So that's one question. All these planned chlordécones that the French state has rolled out are meant to result in some sort of work. So part of the work is making people, giving people the opportunity to test for chlordécone exposure, giving people the opportunity to test their soils for exposure or contamination. But the question of reparation, I think, still has not, and I may be wrong, and pandemic time has kept me away from some of those contemporary debates, but from what I understand of the contemporary debate, still has not really taken us to the historical, right? Like the Becquet families have made a very compelling case for chemical kinship. They've said, we cannot be held individually responsible for this. This is a French state matter. This is a matter that needs to be kind of handled kind of at the level of the federal. This is not about individual tort claims. This is not about individual or familial kind of repair, which I think is super disingenuous. It is actually. Like these people got on a plane and went to the US and bought a patent. These people decided to keep distributing a chemical they knew was toxic. So there's that dimension of repair is still not being addressed in the way that I think, or I'm sure others, and I know others think it should be addressed, including Confiant and Boutrin, who've been very clear, like this is not the end result that we imagined. I think too, but I also think there's something really powerful about, I know how scary the statistics about chlordécone in the kind of breast milk and the umbilical cord blood is, but it also, the thing that I say to most people who work in Caribbean studies is that we have an example here of something we can document. Like this is happening all over the region with all other kinds of chemicals. Like this is not unique to Martinique. It's just that we have the resources to document it, because Martinique is a wealthy place compared to the rest of the region. And I think that's the piece we need to pay more attention to, also in terms of chemical kinship. And that's part of what I've been trying to document on my own. So this talk is a part of the project where I'm trying to understand the distribution of this chemical from Virginia elsewhere in the world. So I'm trying to understand, it's in Cameroon, it's in Puerto Rico, it's all over the place, right? But the people in those places don't have the same kinds of resources as people in Martinique to uncover this history. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to understand that circulation as a trans-imperial, transatlantic problem. Yeah, so I'm gonna stop there, but that's the goal. You know, I don't think there's a repair, but we still need to diagnose. Look, Manning Marable, who taught me a lot about Black studies, said there are 3 things we need to do. We need to diagnose, we need to analyze, we need to prescribe. Yep. Those were his 3. It needs to be diagnostic, analytical, prescriptive. That's Black studies. And I feel like I'm still in diagnostic. And we're all still in diagnostic. We're still trying to get diagnostic. In addition, oh, I'm sorry, Donna, you're here. Dr. Davis, excuse me.
Oh no, I'm just saying yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I wasn't stopping you.
Get the diagnostic right, so that we can get the analytical and the prescriptive right.
Right. And that diagnostic is also, according to Manning, corrective, which is what your work is doing also. So correcting the record, setting the record straight. And speaking of setting the record straight, we're over time because of the wonderful time that we're having, and we're going to end with a question by the redoubtable, enigmatic, and inimitable Dr. Donna Ain Davis.
Okay. Okay, so my question really is, if you can just say something briefly, what your thinking is about articulations of racial capitalism in a francophone context. I think we think of racial capitalism relative to Anglophone life experiences, translations from Manchester, England. So how are the spatial and are you thinking about the spatial and political relations manifest in a place where production and distribution are not rooted in factory?
That is a beautiful question. Thank you. Yes. I think this is at the root of a lot of my challenges conceptually and analytically. Thank you really for that question, but also for what I'm hoping to write into in this project. So I'm trained as I'm an Anglophone, I'm an English speaking person, I'm in the Anglophone world. But I think there's the kind of overemphasis on the factory farm in the Anglophone world, the plantation in the Anglophone world has a tremendous bearing, and perhaps a kind of obfuscating bearing on the rest of, especially in the Caribbean, the region. And so part of what I want to do with racial capitalism, and so this talk that I gave is going to come out as an article in a special issue on reproducing racial capitalism, edited by Jennifer Morgan and Elise Weinbaum in Histories of the Present, which I'm so excited to be a part of, and I'm grateful to them for bringing this talk that way. But this talk also had a whole other life as part of the Patchy Anthropocene project that Anna Singh and Niels Boubans were working on, I was part of there. And then this talk had an earlier life and in a million, so this talk has had a million lives as a project. But the thing that has remained true to it is the sense that Anglophone spheres of understanding race, for example, and kinship, as well as kind of Anglophone spheres of understanding the plantation and the factory form are not the same as what's happening in the Francophone world. So even the question of demographics, like who's being sent from Europe to the Caribbean, what kinds of people, what kinds of family, is it second sons? Is it the question of, the people who are, kind of most maligned in a particular kind of world are being sent across the ocean to make their fortune in the Caribbean, right? These are actually different questions for the Anglophone and Francophone world, and they play out as different kinds of worlds of imperial domination. And I think there's a way that our understanding of racial capitalism is really entirely, as you said in your question, founded on the Manchester model, right? Like this is capitalism. These are factories in the field, a la Manchester, rather than a la, I'm losing my thread, but insert the kind of working class region of France where the factory might be. And they're different. And they have different kind of models for labor and conscription and affiliation and kind of the relationship of labor to overseers. So part of what I want to think about here and do here is bring into conversation these imperial zones and their differences. And I think the Caribbean studies is so beautifully primed to do that for all of us. I think it's the reason why so many of us land in this kind of regional world of Caribbean studies, the Caribbean Studies Association, thank goodness for it. And we try to figure out how to work across imperial zones, and it's hard work. It's almost impossible. We're not reading the same things. We don't have the same kinds of senses of the present nor of history. I mean, like really basically, like the racial capitalism conversation is an Anglophone, right? Like what are the Francophone folks are not having the same conversation. So we're not having the same conversations about how the world has been made that we live in. How do we build radically new conceptions of kin and care? And I think there's an opportunity here for all of us to try to understand in a deeper way the differences and the kind of futures and horizons that arise out of those differences. That's all I can say right now, but thank you, Dr. Davis, for that question. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Agard-Jones, for a brilliant talk.
Thank you. And that is an apt coda. And I wonder if those of us who are here who are in a position to turn on your cameras for a moment of appreciation, for applause or recognition of the work that's been done here tonight, whether we can have that. And maybe you can unmute so we can all applaud also.
Oh my gosh, I'm meeting people for the first time.
And thank you.
Ava! Yay! Thank you all. So thrilled to see you all.
Thank you
for
so
being
much.
here. Really, truly. I am in awe of so many, all of you. I'm looking at all of you. The work is just so mind-boggling. So thank you for being here to listen to and think with me. Truly.
And Vanessa and Jafari, thank you so much for doing this. It was wonderful. Donna, thank you so much for your amazing and generous introductions. This was a scintillating discussion about care and chemicals and kin. I just want to say, Vanessa, I'm so glad you're my neighbor because I have so much to talk to you about. I was in Cameroon on a banana growing region, so we have a lot to talk about. I want to thank you all for joining us and to invite you to come back on Monday, the 25th of April for our penultimate lecture in our series on emergent care and community. On April 25th, we will be welcoming Dr. Kathleen Sterling of SUNY Binghamton. She will present a lecture entitled Building Ice Age Community in Stone. Until then, be well, stay healthy and safe. And good night to everybody. Thank you so much.